document is. So Aristotle,
Yep.
when trying to understand the form of drama, specifically Greek drama, like dramatists like Sophocles or whatever, and grand poems in general, he tried to sort of codify and articulate the experience of drama as a form and how plays were written and the structure of plays. And this is, I think, the earliest known document that is analyzing story structure. So people always have come back to this as kind of a foundational document in terms of how to articulate stories and plays for writers. And as a writer, well, what do? You read Aristotle's Poetics, and it has some amazingly, has some good nuggets.
Yeah, some timeless nuggets in there, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
The first being stories should have beginning, middle, and end. Who knew? But like it had to be said. It had to be said by somebody,
Yes, somebody had to say it.
Right.
Aristotle volunteered. So Adam read the original, not the original document. That would be very expensive. He read.
I can't speak Greek or read ancient Greek yet.
Unfortunately, yet. Yeah. But Adam read Aristotle's Poetics, and what I read is something I just mentioned, which is called Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters, and this is the one that was assigned at NYU by John. And to give you a brief kind of understanding of how this book is structured, because the whole point of this is that we read books so you don't have to. Essentially, Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters is taking lessons from Aristotle's Poetics and helping to interpret them and apply them to screenplays instead of plays, instead of like those kinds of stories. So it has a ton of quotes from Aristotle from Poetics. And so when Adam and I were chatting about it before, we had a pretty complete, like, this book gave me a pretty complete understanding of what Aristotle was talking about and also provided context. Interestingly, this book is also 100 pages longer than Aristotle's Poetics because of that fact. So it is an interesting.
It's a dense book. It's a dense little book.
It is a dense little book that is made of very short little chapters, so that can help kind of break through the density of it. But
so let's jump in. What do you think? How does the book start?
So this one, the one by Michael Tierno, starts with this idea called the action idea, which is not even something that Aristotle said necessarily. Aristotle did not use the phrase action-idea, but this is a distillation of all the things that Aristotle did say. And essentially what it is that it's saying that your idea for a story must be based in an action. It's not based in a character. It's not based in a setting. It's based in a specific action. And the character is the person who performs it and gives kind of the emotional depth to it. But that overall, your idea has to be an action. So it's called the action-idea, the action idea. So what that is it kind of reminded me, Adam, about how when we talk about log lines, we talk about vivid verbs, right? Like, what is the vivid verb of what your protagonist is doing? Like, are they investigating? Are they trying to kill a killer shark, stop a killer shark? What is the vivid verb that they're doing? That's really what this refers to. And essentially, when you create an action idea, it's very similarly written to a log line. It's a little bit longer. And it can be multiple sentences. I can share some of those in a moment. He has some good examples in here. But the idea is that it has to be evocative on its own. So, like, it has to be something that gives you a taste of the catharsis that you would get from the entire film right in that little description. So you have to be able to feel what the emotions are going to be when you read it. So maybe it actually would be good for me to give an example. Let me grab it. So the example that he made up was that, say you have an idea about someone who likes cars. Likes is not really an action. So he said, okay, what if he likes them so much that he steals them? And steals is better than likes, right? So they wrote out this action idea that says, this is the story of Joe Schmo. Joe Schmo steals cars to help kids in his neighborhood go to college, but he eventually decides he's setting a bad example, so he goes to college himself so that someday he can get a real job and earn money to put his kids through school. At college, he struggles to transcend his 50 IQ, but instead of bribing teachers to pass his classes, he decides to pass on his own merits, setting the ultimate example for his kids. So this is a little bit longer than a log line. It covers the beginning, middle, and end, but it's all focused around specific actions. So steals cars, goes to college, struggles, transcends, he doesn't bribe, he passes on his own merits. And so that's loosely the idea here, is that instead of it just being about a guy who feels this way, the entire outline, the mini outline for this, is based in action. And yeah, that was a little long, but that's like the way that this author really frames everything that Aristotle was talking about. I find that
there's a in poetics, there's also, I think, a foundational idea. I'm trying to source where the writer of this book got that kind of idea, because he didn't directly talk about stories being, he'd actually didn't even talk about story ideas, right? He's more just describing the form. So I think from a screenwriter's point of view, so much of it is about log lines and story concepts, right? But what I was trying to say is that the idea of imitation is kind of the foundational thing that leads to what action is, right? Because in Aristotle, objects of imitation are men in action, right? You could say characters who do things, right?
Yeah.
But the imitation that is of that is like, what is that? It's the depiction of characters, period, right? Like, he actually makes the argument, which I think is kind of interesting, that, and relevant to screenwriters in the sense of, so often we just sort of make core assumptions about, like, oh, I'm making a movie about these things. The intentionality, though, which he defines, like, well, why do artists create things? Like, what is the thing you're doing? Like, when you're creating a character, are they imitating life? Is a good play imitating reality based on observation of who people really are? Are you making an observation of thought? Are you making an observation of like I think there's kind of an idea of, like, what are you doing? But you're creating an imitation of life through words, through characters, through actions, right? And so when I think the idea that objects are an imitation, the objects of imitation, stories and plays, are men in actions, people, characters who do things. Now he goes on to talk about the difference between tragedy and comedy and all of that shit. But sorry, I shouldn't say swear. But I think, like, there's a foundational aspect to this that I think is useful for people to think, like, okay, I'm a writer. I want my story to be about something. I want to be about somebody who likes cars, or you want to be a car fanatic who has some sort of action, and they're taking some sort of conflict in their life into their own hands, right? What is kind of your responsibility of, like, what do you choose to portray, and is it true, right? Like, are you imitating life well, is kind of what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah.
And but understanding kind of, like, what are you actually doing here as a writer is a question I don't think many screenwriting books really, they just kind of take for granted, right? Like,
for sure. Yeah. Here's a quote that is in here from Aristotle. It says, a tragedy, then, is the imitation of an action that is serious, has magnitude, and is complete in itself. And so the author in this book spent some time explaining what imitation means, right? And it's not what a lot of modern readers would assume is like a one-to-one imitation, like a copy. It's the artistic reflection of something, like how art imitates life. It's like what a painting is to life. It's not a one-to-one copy. And the writer says here, any screenwriter or development exec will tell you that reality is often quite boring and not dramatic enough to produce the kind of engagement and emotional response that your artist is looking for. So essentially what it is that you are recreating life in a way that recreates the emotion, which usually cannot be done with just a one-to-one copy, right? You can't just if you'd have to copy your entire life beginning to end if you were going to do the one-to-one copy. No one wants to sit through a 18-year movie or something.
Right.
So
And
yeah.
in Poetics, he talks about, how a lot of lesser playwrights will misunderstand kind of like what makes a great subject for a story, right? Like making a biographical story about Hercules or something, like a lot of bad playwrights will like, well, I want to encapsulate the whole life rather than what is one action and one great moment in their life, right? It's kind of like saying one story objective. And he says like the Odyssey is a great story, not because it encapsulates Odysseus's life and tries to like, do the biopic reading of everything that happened to them, but it takes one journey, one grand adventure, one thing, one action, going home,
So
right?
how would you apply this idea to screenwriting?
I think you could very much make a one-to-one that the story objective of the protagonist is an action that they have to undertake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's kind of a takeaway, right? Like, and you want to make sure that your story objective is the story you want to tell, right? Like it's connected to thoughts and ideas and themes you want to talk about. Like he has a lot of points about, he basically breaks down story into, there's, the imitation sort of foundational idea, right? But there's plot, character, thought, diction, song, a melody, a spectacle, right? These different ideas, right? And you could say that he argues that plot is the most foundational core representation of the idea, right? Plot is the action. It is the things that happen. It's the events. It's the imitation of the actions that characters take. And character is sort of a subset of that. It's more about, not vibes, but, they are the means by which actions take place, right? The characters live out the actions. They talk to the audience. They're a vehicle for that idea, anything. And then there's thought, which is the themes and ideas, the philosophical underpinnings of the dialogue, the message the writer wants to communicate with the piece, and diction, which is more like the words and the style, and of it, all these things are interconnected, right? But I see it as a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, there's plot, but character rests on plot. The thought and themes rests on character. The diction and style and the way you tell the story rests on the philosophical ideas. And then finally, you have the spectacle, which is kind of, honestly, he was talking more about like set design in that situation. But like you could make the case for
Set
screenwriters,
pieces.
something like the visuals, the set pieces, kind of the visual lens into the world is kind of the cherry on top. But at the base of the idea, it's the structure of action. What is the thing that happens, and its beginning, middle, and end? Who are the people involved in this, and what are the choices they make along the way? What are the ideas and concepts and themes? So I that's kind of my interpretation of those sort of five.
Sort of a food pyramid, isn't it?
It is a food pyramid, yeah.
And so you have the plot at the bottom, then you have the character on the next level, then you have thought, then you have diction, then if you are around in Aristotle's time, you have song, and then you have spectacle at the little tippy top of your pyramid. It's interesting because Theo and I, a couple weeks ago, spoke at length about the story triangle. And something that we were discussing according to that theory is Theo really, really strongly believes that character, world, and plot are all equally important when you're creating an idea. And so that's just like, you can choose if you agree or not, but it's interesting because Aristotle would apparently strongly disagree. He would not like the story triangle. He would build this pyramid, right, where plot is the foundation and is the most critical.
I think the difference is that's the idea you were talking about is more of a relational triangle of where there's like kind of a more of a Venn diagram, and his pyramid is more of like a foundation. It's a one-way image, or that rather than three sort of things in balance with each other.
Yeah. It's just an interesting way of kind of realizing that there's multiple ways to visualize the ways that story works. Something I wanted to talk about that I found surprisingly deep but very funny was his beginning, middle, and end, and the way that he defines it. And you know,
I got it right here too.
yeah, it's pretty. So basically, the way that he defines it, at least like top level, right, is the beginning is where the actions first take place, where there's nothing important before it. The middle is something that follows something, and another thing follows it. And the end is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing else following it. So the beginning is something that doesn't follow anything, the middle follows something and has something following it, and the end follows something and has nothing following it. Or has nothing, it's following nothing, but it's following something else. So it's sort of like this, what is it, like a cyclical or whatever it's called, answer of like what a beginning, middle, and end is. But it's surprising, like it sounds very silly, but it's surprisingly
No,
deep.
it's
Yeah,
it's a scientific explanation of what the components are, right? Like,
yeah,
what is a beginning other than something that it's the start of the action where nothing before can have happened,
yeah,
right? It's simple, it's powerful. I have a question. So, what is conceptually something you've gotten out of this that you find is useful and compelling?
just overall, you mean, like,
Yeah,
or out of the
overall.
beginning, middle, and end?
No, overall, this whole book.
Okay. Well, there was one part of this that I thought was very helpful, and it was this section here called "Why is my beautiful plot growing a hand out of its head?" And basically, it was talking about when your stories start sprawling off in different directions and you start kind of watering down the core message of what you're doing. And it was talking about how Aristotle compared a story, or I guess a tragedy probably is probably more accurate to what he was saying, to an organic unity of a living creature. Like that Aristotle was talking about story as a living creature, where the scenes are the different organs and things like that. And I'm a little unclear how much of this is directly pulled from Aristotle and how much is the interpretation, but I think I'm not mistaken that Aristotle did talk about story as a living creature. And that basically every single scene should be an essential organ, which is such a like visceral way of putting it, but it's an essential organ serving the same living creature. And that's a long way of saying that every single scene needs to serve your core plot, and that everything
Yes.
should be vital, right? That was kind of helpful for me, is to be like, not only does every scene need to justify, like John a lot of times talk about justifying each scene. And one way to think about it is like, will my story die without this scene, without this vital organ? Like, how important is it? But also that it's the vitality, or not vitality, the importance of the organ is not just plot information. It's also giving an understanding of the magnitude of the emotions. So he's not saying like, if it doesn't, like every single thing has to be beat, 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 beat. It can also lean into the emotions and express to the audience why this story matters so much. So that was my favorite thing.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
I mean, my recollection, it's a similar side of the same coin in the sense of he talks a lot about the power of what he calls unity of action,
Mhm.
right? Where there should be a clear logic between the flow of everything, right? And he's basically saying that it comes from structure, right? So if you have a plot that has a beginning, a middle, and an end that's driven by the actions of characters, right? Of great men of moral fortitude that qualify to be in a tragedy, whatever. You have a clear sense of, okay, this event happens, therefore this much happened. It's kind of the sense of the but therefore he articulates as like kind of the plot must be coherent. Everything that happens must have a clear reflection of what just happened before. And so
So,
when you have an end, it's inevitable, truly.
So just to support what you're saying, Adam, I found this quote that he pulled from Poetics. It says, to be beautiful, a living creature, and every whole made up of parts must not only be present in a certain order in its arrangement of parts, but also be of a certain definite magnitude. So, in order, like, for your organs to work, they can't just be in
Yes.
random spots. The order, like what Adam was saying, matters, and the magnitude of them matters. So, like, how much they impact the story and how much they ultimately give to that moment of catharsis at the end. I'm curious, was that your favorite takeaway, the catharsis stuff?
Actually, I mean, so there are two ideas that I really, really liked. The idea of reversals and recognitions being the sort of way of articulating character transformation as a setup for the fear and pity of a catharsis, just a setup for everybody a little bit. So he kind of defines this idea of catharsis as an emotional purging that the audience goes through when they watch great works, great stories. And that emotional purging is best, and this language I think is specific to tragedies, but like fear and pity is the feeling he wants. And he also makes a big list of these stories where bad things happen to, or good things happen to bad people. No fear and pity there, because that's vulgar, right? Or like he'll make a bunch of arbitrary, he's making a very specific thing of like, I'm trying to talk about tragedy, but he also conflates tragedy with great storytelling. And I think when we're making a modern reading, we're trying to get a lot of variety of story perspectives and impacts out of that. But fear and pity is the feeling the audience should feel for the characters when they are emotionally purging and experiencing catharsis. And the thing I kind of liked was the way to get that is at a key moment at the height of the conflict to have a reversal of fortune. And you could have multiple reversals. He actually quite likes that idea. He says complex stories, which he basically means good stories, complex stories have reversals and recognition scenes. And he then basically he said like the most important moments where we create that emotional experience are reversal scenes with a recognition scene. It was kind of interesting. So what he means by a reversal scene, it's a sudden change in the protagonist's fortunes from good to bad or bad to good, right? You could have a lot of reversals throughout your story, but a really key reversal has a moment of recognition. A moment of recognition is a moment where something is learned, where the character goes from ignorance to knowledge in an important way. So I really like this idea.
Reveal? Can recognition be called reveal?
No,
not quite
because
the same?
It's specific. He's specifically talking about like character growth and a recognition of emotional truth. Like a critical discovery. Like it could be like, oh my God, the butler did it. That's a moment of recognition. Or, oh my God, I'm married to my mother. That's a moment of recognition, Oedipus, right? Or, oh my God, I'm in the Matrix. That's a moment of recognition. It's where the character goes from ignorance to knowledge. And here's the thing, the Matrix recognition scene, that ain't the all is lost scene. I think what he's talking about is a recognition scene tied to a reversal in fortune for the negative. That's the magic that creates the fear and pity, which is the catharsis, right? So I thought that was a great actual kind of, I actually thought it was the best description of the all is lost moment I've ever heard, because everybody talks, a really bad thing happens and then the character changes. Well, what else has changed but a character learning something, their inner need, knowledge. Oh my God, I learned something I didn't, from a reversal of fortune. Something really bad happens. The end of act 2, we go through our all is lost. I really liked that articulation. I thought it was really interesting.
So when I think of catharsis, normally the first place in a movie that I think of is not the all is lost. Usually I would think of the catharsis as like, I would think of that as like the feeling at the end, at like the very end of the movie, like kind of like around the resolution, specifically usually in that final fight where you have that back-to-back moment where you have the catastrophic failure.
I think that might actually be what he's talking about.
Is that catastrophic failure potentially?
I think it's a both thing. Like, I think it's a
I was
Yeah.
about to say that it's interesting because I do think it works in both places, but I think specifically the fear and pity catharsis fits into the all is lost very, very well.
And here's the thing. The modern American movie hinges on a tragic moment that turns into a happy ending. What
Yeah.
he's talking about is a descent into tragedy and great ironies, right? And that's just the movie ends on the all is lost moment, or the Greek play ends on the all is lost moment. So that's what
So
he's talking about.
sad.
American or modern movies have kind of two catharsis moments built in. One, where the moment where the character changes, and then two, the moment where we, the audience, see that change. It's like a two-part catharsis, right? The
Yeah.
character changes, then we change because they changed.
Yeah.
It's kind of how I see it.
It's interesting because, like, you know, when I think of catharsis, I don't necessarily think of the fear and pity moment. I think of the relief you feel when that is finally alleviated as the catharsis. And so I don't necessarily think that, like, I'm not saying Aristotle is wrong. I just think it's interesting that I
Well,
never really thought of it that
if you
way.
were watching Greek tragedies
Yeah.
back then, like the big moment of release and catharsis is when everybody dies and it's all tragic and the grand irony is revealed, right? So like the emotional experience is,
Yeah.
oh damn, Oedipus just stabbed out his own eyes in penance for fucking his mom and killing his dad unintentionally because he was so prideful, right? It's kind of like that's the mechanism of that thing, right? We have a different when you watch a modern Pixar movie or whatever, like a generic American movie, the DNA of it is just a little changed, but
Yeah.
some of the pieces are the same, right? Like the structure of it's different, but the pieces are the same. Like there is
No,
the fear
totally.
and pity is in all is lost, but the catharsis is in the end, whereas in the Greek tragedy, it's all happening all at once right at the end.
But it is interesting to think of it as fear and pity. So, like, for us, when we were looking at films, we talk about the final fight, which is so there's the all is lost, which is the first beat of your act three. They had just had their ultimate test and they failed somehow, and now they're at their lowest point. And so that's a moment of intense fear and pity, I
Yeah.
suppose, that where they realize they are so alone and distraught that they realize that they screwed up and they realize what their flaw is. They have
I think
this
that's the fear and pity moment from
yeah.
according to the Aristotle definition, because he's talking about fear and pity from the audience for the
Yeah.
characters, right? Like we feel fear and pity.
Yeah. And then so then I think a lot of times the character in that moment also kind of feels that way, at least in like
Usually
modern stuff,
it's a
because
great
that
pain that forces them to have recognition.
the dark night of the soul, as you once called it.
That's right. I didn't come up with that.
I know you didn't,
Yeah.
but I still find it
Yeah.
amusing. But then so what happens in that is that they figure out their inner need. And then they charge back. They have their all is nothing. They run back to confront the antagonist or go after their objective one last time to do the thing. And then in the final fight, what's his name? We're actually going to talk about him later. Who came up with the three beat? Who broke down the three beats? I want to say
Michael
Arndt. Broke down the final fight as like this sequence. It's like only 3 to 5 minutes that has these 3 beats, which is the catastrophic failure. So right out the gate, they've changed, but it's not enough. The catastrophic failure. Then they have a decisive action. So this is an action that they would have never ever taken at the very beginning of the movie, but because they're changed, they do. And then there's the unexpected success. So they succeed, but it should be in a way that we weren't quite expecting, just to keep things fresh. And I suppose even in that catastrophic failure of the final fight, you do need to create feelings of pity. And what's the other? Fear and pity, right?
Yeah, it's like a mini all is lost moment. I mean, in modern story structure, it's which I honestly don't think that structure of the like a Michael Arndt final fight really existed until like 40 years ago. Like it's very much like a evolution of like high impact storytelling, but like that specific version of it, I think, is really really modern. And
Yeah.
I think in a good way. Like, I think it is a mini Fear and Pity moment, but it's immediately undercut by a positive transformation, right? Like, according to Aristotle, stories with happy endings, he's not talking about any of that. That's like, he's like, oh, that's a comedy, simple story. I'm not even concerned about that. Like, he's very much talking about something very specific, and he almost conflates it. Like, tragedies are the good ones, you know.
Yeah.
Although he does talk about epic poems as being kind of different in that sense, because, you know, the Odyssey has a happy ending, you know.
It'd be fun to see what he thinks of like a Pixar movie. Someone should
he'd probably have a stroke and die again from seeing animation and being confused about the world. I mean, but it's all about cultural context, right? Like, in that context, in that moment, the good stories were the tragedies. So that
I wonder
was
why that was. I wonder what about, because, like, you know how I love thinking about this, though, that, like, the types of stories that you tell are really reflective of the culture that you're in. I wonder, I've never thought about why it was that the Greeks really liked tragedy.
Well, it's I think, according to this one primary document I've read, you know, and he talks about a lot of Greek playwrights who I've never heard of in my life, you know, like at least 20 names that he's referring, and this guy sucked because of this, but he had a good point here, you know. It's like, he had some good stuff. Oh, and this Italian guy, whatever. But to answer my theory is, you know, it's because, in terms of the function of the stories in the time and how they interacted with society, that was the story form where people reflected deep moral lessons of what to avoid and how to reflect. And he's very specific about, you know, the best plays have this moment of recognition of fear and pity that are, and he's very specific about what type of character can have this. He says it can't be somebody who's too virtuous, because it can't just be bad things happening to a good person. He actually, this is a great nugget. He says the seeds of the seeds of failure in a great tragedy come from mistakes and mistakes they make, which is basically a flaw. He says the character's flaw has to destroy them for it to be a tragedy, good tragedy. And I think the other thing is that a lot of these other plays, the flaws were more like specific to who they were, and this is the only story form at that time that had transformation of emotional transformation, right? Like a good person made some mistakes and their life is destroyed is a story of transformation. And I think a lot of the comedies he was talking about are very much like stories about bad people or people's more vulgar situations, like, oh, I'm going to watch this political satire about this senator and he's so lustful and these are all these problems that are going to happen. He's like, that wasn't a great source of tragedy, and neither was watching this horrible warlord and how terrible they are and bad things happen to them or good things happen to them. It's very much somebody you can relate to, not somebody who's too virtuous, not somebody who's too flawed, who makes mistakes and has a failure. So I think it's just about transformation, right? Like, it's a story form that was really moving people because it had transformation, and they just hadn't quite figured out how to do story arcs in a way that was as moving, or at least he hadn't watched them. I'm sure that they existed, you know.
It seems also like they were more into moralizing, and that as time has gone on, people have had less patience for.
We still do.
We moralize the crap out of things. But you have to. It, like, people for the most part don't like to know that you're doing it, even though it's very obvious that that's what's happening, right? It's just, if they feel as walked into it as some of these ancient, like, not ancient, but, you know, old Greek things are, then people today don't tend to respond very well. Like, you know, when it's too moralizing, I think of like the like religious films that are actually like, this is a lesson that I sought out to teach you, and people don't really respond. Like, the average audience does not really respond to that now.
Well, Oedipus is a good play, right? And at the end of the day, if it's good, you don't think it's moralizing, even if it totally is, right? Like, you know, like you're thinking about, oh man, bad day, you know,
that's
or
true.
Like, oh wow, that's really interesting, or oh, that sucks, right? Like, you're if the writing is good, the morals are under the surface, right? Like, and I think just bad plays in general, bad movies, it's like, the character arc at the end is just so ham-fisted. But I think that I actually can't think of a great film in the last 40 years that didn't have some kind of strong moral point of view, even if it was a counter or a critique of a moral point of view. You know what I mean? Like a huge movie. I just first thing came to my mind, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
Huge moral. Talk to your daughter. Be honest about who you are. Make space for people you love. It's like it actually crams all these morals in your face through the lens of character transformation. Yeah, right. Because if it's through the lens of good writing or a story idea that's interesting and surprising, the thing I think we all hate, what you're talking about, is the moralizing that's like the writer talking to you.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
It's like, okay, thanks, Mr. Screenwriter.
I feel like the good morals are like the good moralizing that happens is almost when you have to think about it a little bit. Like it's still fairly obvious, but it's not like you leave going like, oh wow, they just taught me that I need to talk to my daughter. It might make you feel like, man, maybe I should call my daughter, but it's not like it's not as conscious as like
it should be unconscious, ideally, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of the same thing about like, you could talk about morals and political ideas and philosophical ideas, all the things that are like the under the thought category, Aristotle's point of view, like the themes and ideas, the guts of what the characters are saying and the why of why they say it, and etc. Mm-hmm. You could get into that with anything and be kind of annoyed or disagree, or if it's a good play but you disagree with the idea, that's interesting. If it's a bad play but you agree with the idea, you hate that too. It's all about, do we believe the imitation of life that this is, right? Is this well done? And I think people obsess over the wrong things. I don't know. I mean, I think the writers who claim, oh my God, my work's not political, or this film is not this, or I don't have a moral, I just want to show the characters real. Like, no, that's not true. Everyone has morals they live and die by. Everyone has a point of view. Everyone has a political context. You can't portray characters. You can't portray an imitation of life, whether that's a book, a play, a movie, and not have morals and not have ethics and not have a political point of view, because that's just who people are. People have those things.
Yeah. And even if you literally shot somebody going about their life, the things that you choose to include would be colored by the politics of the time, like of your morals, by your politics, by all these different things, even if you don't know it. That was something that Avi told us that I think you and I both really latched onto and remembered. It is just like that everything is political. Yep. Because at the end of the day, we're telling a story that is meant to be shared with the world. And the world is locked in politics. And so when your story is out there in the world, it will engage, like it will be read in the time that you've created it. So if I released, when Parasite is released, the way that it is political, like it's the politics of Parasite are so baked into it, for example.
Right.
And the way that would be interpreted is probably different when it came out versus 10 years before versus 10 years after. Just everything is political because we live in a political world. Trying to think, was there anything else that you really, really loved from this?
There were a few things. I mean, I'm just looking here,
Oh, yeah. Here's one that I thought was interesting, which was that, here's a quote from him. Artifice must be reserved for matters outside of the play, for past events beyond human knowledge or events yet to come, which require to be foretold or announced, since it is the privilege of the gods to know everything. Therefore, there should be nothing improbable among the actual incidences. If it is unavoidable, however, the improbable incidences should be outside of the tragedy. So basically like saying everything that happens in your story should be logical and believable. And if you need something unbelievable to happen, it should happen before the beginning of your story, off screen, after the end. So I think that in a way it's kind of like, it's speaking to a bunch of different things, but it also kind of reminds me of world building and how it's exposition too, right? If something truly unbelievable happens, then it's your job to reveal only the pertinent pieces as they become relevant to the story. Like only the exposition is only useful when it's creating active problems for your protagonist. We don't need to run through every single thing that happened in some sort of chronological order in order to tell the story. But I thought that was nice. Basically, if it's unrealistic, don't put it on the screen. Have it be something that happened off screen and keep everything that's happening in your story logical. And he had the whole perspective of like, you know, essentially it read to me like keeping the interference of gods and like extraordinary deities and kind of deus ex machina, like keeping that kind of thing out of your story is also kind of what that meant to me. But I thought it was...
Yeah, it's just an advocacy for good, clean storytelling where causality matters, where stories begin where they should begin, they end where they end. You don't clutter things up with extraneous ideas or subplots or characterizations. The characterizations and the plot ideas, the things that happen, should all be connected to what is the core idea, what is the core action you're trying to represent. Why does it matter? It's honestly just a really clean case for minimalism and thoughtfulness. Thoughtfulness in terms of, you know, your thoughtfulness of why you create as an artist, you know, in terms of like, okay, I'm going to write about a high school teacher. Have I observed enough about life to imitate this well? You know?
Yeah. And we have an interesting question that came in from Michelle that says, do you think he was saying that for story purposes or because special effects on stage would be super expensive? Showing Zeus throwing thunderbolts on stage would probably be expensive. You know, that is true, that he did care about the set. Adam, you were saying that like one of the, which one part was it?
Spectacle.
That he does care about the spectacle. I think in this case, I think in this particular instance, he was referring to kind of like keeping Deus Ex Machina out and
He's also not a playwright himself and not involved with the theater. He's just a fan. So I don't think he really cared about logistical considerations of cost.
Oh, man. And also, I feel like back then when they threw lightning bolts, it'd just be kind of someone going like, rah, rah.
Yeah.
I don't think that they would feel the need. Like, I don't know that they felt the need to make it super beautiful. Like, they were very good at using their imagination. I will say that. You know, they didn't even care to have actual women performing. So that was them, right?
I mean, that's ancient Greece. Greece.
Yeah. It was all performed by men. So, you know, I don't know how much they were worried about realism, but it's an interesting thought that he was just concerned about the special effects budget. That'd be nice. But awesome. So I guess to kind of put all these ideas together, Adam, you read Aristotle's Poetics. I read Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters. Who would you recommend that book to? Who would you
Poetics?
Yep.
Anyone who's like interested in how things work, and does not mind reading ancient Greek writers, at least good translations of them. I really enjoyed it more than I thought I would. It was more enjoyable to read this than 90% of the screenwriting books I've read, just because it was like actually like but I'm more used to reading that type of stuff. So like, if that's your bag, do it. But like, it was really interesting. I got a lot out of it, actually.
Yeah. And then for me, Aristotle's Poetics for Screenwriters by Michael Tierno. I think that this one is probably more approachable for screenwriting purposes.
Definitely easier to read.
Yeah, definitely easier to read. And he does like, he does a lot of the work of kind of interpreting what Aristotle was saying, like explaining what he meant by imitation, explaining what he meant by, you know, catharsis, explaining what he means in all these different cases, and then doing the work of directly applying it to films and providing tons of film examples. Like, Adam, there's one chapter in this that you would love. Are you ready? Are you ready to hear it?
I love it. I'm ready.
Let me find the title of it so I don't mess it up. All right. Why can't I find the table of contents in this little book? 1 second. Here we go. It is called What the Poetics Says About Epics, like Lord of the Rings.
Hey, there we go.
I was like, wow.
But to be annoying, he wasn't talking about epics of that like he was talking about grand poems.
Yeah.
Like Homer, like, which is a very specific thing. I don't even think Lord of the Rings necessarily. I mean, it's a grand adventure. It is
pretty grand. It takes a bunch
of
movies.
It is. I just don't know if it qualifies the same way. Like, it's a big story, but that's not necessarily what he means by epic.
No, and I think that the thing I will say about this writer is I think that they're pretty fair. That they're like, when they're applying something to something that isn't necessarily what Aristotle could have ever imagined. But
of course, I don't think he could have ever imagined Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. Like, I don't think that was on his radar.
It's really outside of his point of view.
Yeah, but I think that overall, if you are interested in Aristotle and are a screenwriter and want to know more about it, but don't necessarily want to have to like spend time parsing through, oh, what did he mean by this, and like doing that deep work of applying the thinking for yourself, that this book is really great. And this is the one that we read specifically in school. And I feel like it does give you a pretty accurate understanding of what is actually in Aristotle's Poetics because of how many quotes it pulls and things like that. It's obviously not the same as the full.
Yeah, I do think it has its own point of view as well.
Oh, it definitely does. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely its own point of view, but it is useful. And I think that it could be good for more beginning writers, whereas maybe Aristotle's Poetics would be best for someone who is more versed in stories so that they can find the connections themselves between what they've learned before and what Aristotle is saying. So that'd be my thought. But overall, I think that they're both pretty great. Yeah. Before we go, though, I wanted to let people know that from now until July 20th, we are doing a summer promotion of Writing the Pilot. You can get Writing the Pilot for 30% off if you use the discount code SUMMER24, because I like to be very straightforward in those coupon codes. And we talk about a lot of things in a similar way to this. It's me and Adam made that course together, and we really spend a lot of time breaking down how story works, specifically episodic narrative. And it teaches you how to write a pilot script, but also how to plot your entire series. So we do all of it. So if you vibe with the way that we talk about story, then I think that you would enjoy that course. And it is 30% off right now, which I think puts it at like exactly $100. So we hope that you will check that out. And I will real quick post the link in the description or in the chat so that you all can access it. Again, the discount code is SUMMER24 with all caps in summer. I don't know how much that matters, but hope that you enjoy it. And if there's any other books about screenwriting or storytelling that you would like us to read so you don't have to, please let us know. You can add it in the chat or tell us in the Discord. We are always down for finding more books and finding some golden nuggets for you out of them. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good weekend.